You might know your local P.F. Chang's as the place with the iconic red logo. You might know it as the grandest dining area in town. Or, if you're anything like us, you might just know it as the best night of the week, growing up. Friday or Saturday, when your parents were too tired to cook, and everyone rejoiced in a hearty order of Chinese food. Those nights were marked by a pile of takeout boxes, trial and error with chopsticks, and round-robin fortune cookie reads that may or may not have gotten a little spicy. To this day, not much has changed on a P.F. Chang's night. June 6, 1944, better known as D-Day, was the largest amphibious military operation in history. Boxes of rice still sit in the fridge afterward, leftover sauce packets live in the silverware drawer, and your fortune strip may end up taped on your apartment's refrigerator, or is that just us? Ordering P.F. Chang's is an experience from start to finish, guided by the pure deliciousness of their American Chinese cuisine. The Allied forces under the command of American General Dwight D. The one consistent truth about indulging in the casual chain? The food is so good that, without fail, you'll eat too much. Eisenhower planned and executed a direct assault on what had come to be known as Fortress Europe, a heavily fortified area of France across from the British Isles that presented a brutal barrier to any invading force. The invasion began Operation Overlord, and involved nearly 130,000 soldiers, 5,500 landing craft and ships, 20,000 land vehicles, and 13,000 aircraft. D-Day is remembered as a triumph, as the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. And it's true that less than a year later the Nazi forces had been broken and the Allies were rolling through Berlin, all remnants of the once terrifying German military machine destroyed. That's right. Fortunes aren't the only end to a P, but D-Day was so complex and so logistically complicated it's simplistic to view it as a massive invasion that kicked Nazi butt. Chang's night. They usually pair with a stomach ache. Although it's nearly impossible to avoid that fate, we taste-tested the top dishes at P.F. The truth is more complicated, in part because any operation the size and complexity of D-Day is going to get messy, and in part because it's become American mythology that the U.S. led the biggest invasion ever and ended the worst war of all time. But dig a little deeper, and the mythology doesn't always hold up. Here's the messed up truth about D-Day. D-Day came really close to being a disaster. The idea of invading France was first considered as early as 1942. The invasion is often portrayed as a triumph of careful planning and incredibly brave soldiers, and it certainly was both of those things. But that overlooks one key fact. It also came close to being a horrifying disaster for the Allies. Americans sometimes think that because General Dwight D. Eisenhower was supreme commander of the Allied forces that means America was in charge, but it was a partnership. As history notes, Eisenhower's staff was full of British officers, and the British themselves did much of the planning and logistics work. Chang's in hopes that, just maybe, it will help you make a more targeted order, overcome overeating, and circumvent a post-P.F. One of the reasons Eisenhower was chosen for his role was his ability to get combative personalities to work together, but he threatened to quit and throw the whole operation into disarray when the British pushed back on no-brainer plans to bomb the German lines prior to the landings. In fact, as NPR reports, Eisenhower was so painfully aware of how easily it could go wrong he wrote out a statement to be issued if it went badly. And things did go wrong. Nearly everything, in fact. As Engines of Our Ingenuity notes, the bombs Eisenhower fought for mostly missed their targets, naval bombardments were ineffective, amphibious tanks turned out to be not very amphibious at all, and the weather wasn't ideal, scattering Allied forces. Chang's stomachache. 15. The amazing thing about D-Day is that it succeeded at all. The Germans made a critical mistake. It was no big secret that the Allies were planning to invade France. As history notes, Hitler and his military advisors began planning for it as far back as 1942. It was the obvious way to force the Nazis to spread their forces thin and ease the pressure on Russia in the east. Mongolian Beef first up. P.F. In fact, Hitler ordered a huge string of fortifications to be built that same year, creating what came to be known as the Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, gun emplacements, and landing obstacles that covered 2,400 miles of the French coastline. So the Germans knew the Allies were coming, and they had the weapons, men, and fortifications in place to repel those forces. The chances of failure would have been pretty high, actually, except the Germans got one crucial aspect of their intelligence wrong: where the Allies planned to invade. Through a brilliant deception campaign, the Allies managed to convince Hitler and his high command that the invasion would hit at Calais, about 150 miles northeast of the actual invasion site. Chang's Mongolian Beef. The Nazis couldn't be sure, but the possibility forced them to split their forces, a big reason D-Day succeeded. The brilliant part of all this is that Calais is actually the better choice for an invasion, which made it very believable. Casualties were beyond high. D-Day wasn't just a logistical nightmare, it was a literal nightmare. This bad boy, albeit beautiful to look at, brings up last place in our roundup. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you have some small idea of what the first wave of invaders experienced. The D-Day landings were brutal. In fact, they were probably worse than you can imagine. Estimates of exactly how many men died on those beaches vary pretty significantly, and it's impossible to know precisely how many died in the first wave, but it was a bloodbath. The Guardian notes that thousands of troops were killed by punishing machine gun fire as they waited on shore. We had high hopes, especially after sampling some of P. The Atlantic recounts how men barely managed to jump out of their landing craft before being ripped apart by gunfire. Some entire companies of soldiers were devastated, like a company, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry, which lost 60% of its men in 20 minutes. Men in supposedly amphibious tanks drowned, trapped inside, when the tanks hit the water too soon and sank like metal coffins. The worst part was that this was accounted for. Chang's other beef dishes, which were delicious. But this one lacks what made the others really shine: attention to the beef. The generals planning the invasion knew incredibly high casualty rates were unavoidable. Author G. H. Bennett notes that it was estimated that 13% of all troops would drown before making it to shore, and the assumption was that 25% of Allied forces would die in a successful operation. And history reports that the Allies expected to lose 75% of the paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines just before the invasion. Allied command argued up until the last minute considering what was at stake. You might imagine that the military leaders planning Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasion would want to be solidly in agreement before giving the order. Chang's describes this dish as sweet soy glaze, flank steak, garlic, and green onion. While we can confirm that all of those ingredients do indeed exist in the dish, none of them were particularly well crafted. The flank steak, which looked so appealing before biting in, ended up being an odd combination of tough and chewy, hard to get a bite of, and then, once you had the bite, disappointingly soft on the inside. Besides just having a disconcertingly inconsistent texture within every bite, the lack of consistency between each piece was a bit of a letdown as well. The fact is, they argued over just about every detail right up until the end. History Extra notes that the British and the Americans went back and forth over the details for years. The British even delayed the invasion twice, opting to direct resources to an invasion of northern Africa, Operation Torch, and later an invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. There were good military reasons for these decisions, but the Americans suspected the British were trying to undermine the Normandy plan. While some bits were more cooked through, others were a tad on the fatty side. Instead of leaning into curating their beef slabs to a higher level of perfection, it seems, P.F. as Uva today explains, the British thought invading through Normandy would be too difficult, and weren't afraid to express this opinion. Chang's opts to rely on the sweet soy glaze to bring the entire dish up a level. It's not a bad wager, the sweet soy sauce is amazing. But the way they absolutely douse this dish in the glaze gives them away. And to curated and non-curated palates alike, it's not enough to save the entire meal. 14. In the end, the British only agreed because they worried the Americans would go their own way otherwise, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill continued to argue over every detail. History reports this bickering led to incredible chaos right before D-Day. Crispy honey chicken. The crispy honey chicken. Here's a second dish we were eagerly anticipating. Just looking at it evokes strong memories of Chinese food night as kids, back when this was the most adventurous we'd get with our order. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. But, not unlike the Mongolian beef, this dish fell short of our expectations. First of all, when it arrived, every individual chicken bite was stuck together. Eisenhower actually threatened to resign when Churchill opposed having Allied bombers pulled out of Germany to bombard the defenses in France, which Eisenhower couldn't believe. The threat worked, and the bombers were moved, but it's kind of incredible to think that shortly before the largest amphibious invasion in history the leadership team was in such disarray. The paratrooper drops were a disaster. The Allied forces knew that any attempt to invade Europe via the Normandy beaches would meet stiff resistance. We get it, it's honey chicken, so it should be sticky. But should it be that glued together? Probably not. As Time notes, the German army spent more than 3 years and incredible resources building a series of impressive defenses called the Atlantic Wall. When we slid it out of the takeout container onto the plate, the entire dish moved as one mass. This series of bunkers and guns emplacements was just the outer edge of German defenses. Amusing? Yes. Concerning? Also yes. We picked apart the mound and grabbed a single piece of chicken, more skeptical by that point than we were when the dish arrived. Stickiness aside, this is appetizing to look at, and the piece of chicken held promise. Unfortunately, upon biting in, it became clear that the ratio's just a little out of whack here. They'd been in France for years at this point, and there were real concerns that armored divisions and reinforcements from France's interior would lead to an Allied defeat. As a result, a key part of D-Day involved dropping thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines shortly before the attack. The 101st and 82nd U.S. Airborne Divisions were dropped on the Cherbourg Peninsula and ordered to secure areas, seize bridges and other important transportation links, and sabotage the German defenses. It was a disaster. According to history, bad weather led to the paratroopers being dropped wildly off target, leaving them scattered and vulnerable to snipers and easy capture. Only 1/6 of the men actually reached their rally points. In the darkness and chaos, many paratroopers were forced to form ad hoc units on the run. Many drowned when they accidentally landed in flooded ditches or in rivers. The fact that the paratroopers still managed to carry out their mission is nothing short of incredible. We still don't know how many men died on D-Day. In an age when we have so much data at our fingertips, we generally expect precision. The fried coating makes up about 70% of the bite, which is at least 30% more than it should, even for order-out Chinese food. And you might think that nearly 80 years after the D-Day invasion, an operation that was well documented at every stage, historians would have figured out every detail behind it. This might not have been as much of an issue if there weren't a second factor at play. The honey seemingly seeped into the breading, making it more soggy and wilted than anything else. But the fog of war is real, and there remain a lot of mysteries surrounding D-Day, including exactly how many men died that day. Estimates vary wildly. As history notes, when a D-Day memorial was planned in the late 1990s, historians found it very difficult to figure out who actually died on the beach, as opposed to later in the campaign. There was definitely no crisp factor, as the name would leave you to believe. Ultimately, this dish is better left in your fond childhood memories. 13. Chang's spicy chicken. Dare we say that the Chang's spicy chicken is just the crispy honey chicken, add spice? It's not. According to P, initial estimates ranged from 5,000 to 12,000, finally settling on 4,414 casualties. But that number isn't accurate, and continues to change. As 538 explains, part of the problem is defining the cause of death for a soldier. A wound received on Utah Beach, for example, might take days or weeks to kill the soldier. The clerks who were in charge of tabulating losses also died on those beaches, and the records they carried were lost. And some soldiers simply vanished, either beneath the waves or made unrecognizable by their wounds, preventing them from being counted as an official D-Day casualty. Chang's. They describe it as chicken with signature sweet spicy chili sauce and green onion. But despite how different that description sounds from crispy honey chicken, we think the two have more in common than not. We gave Chang's spicy chicken points for the spice factor. The signature sweet spicy chili sauce truly is sweet and spicy all at once. The official number of soldiers who died on D-Day will likely continue to change for the foreseeable future. Psychological warfare was a huge weapon. When we think of D-Day and the Normandy invasion, we think of guns and bullets, tanks and bombers. That said, this dish has the same issues that the crispy honey chicken had. The sauce seeps into the breading, leaving you with a bite that is primarily soggy breading with a tiny bit of chicken encased inside. We think of the high number of casualties and the immense bravery required to step off those landing craft in the face of withering fire. But there was another aspect to the invasion that was just as crucial, and just as effective: psychological warfare. As History Today notes, there was literally a psychological warfare division, PWD, within the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, and the British Political Warfare Executive, PWE, and the United States Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, collaborated on several psychological warfare operations. As noted by author David Welch, one of their main projects was Nakrikan Fur Die Truppe, News for the Troops, a newspaper designed to look like a legitimate news publication that mixed actual news and other stories with blatant propaganda designed to lower German morale. Close to 1 million copies were dropped in France just before the invasion. Smithsonian Magazine notes that the British also broadcast a regular radio program hosted by Gustav Siegfried Eins, who presented himself as a dedicated Nazi who was outraged at the behavior and failings of the Nazi hierarchy. The chicken itself is nothing to write home about, either. As coffee or die notes, the psychological warfare was deemed a success because Nazi officers complained about their effect, and because so many German prisoners of war were found with the newspapers and other leaflets in their pockets. Stopping Germany wasn't the only goal on D-Day. Mainstream history imbues D-Day and Operation Overlord with supreme importance when it comes to ending World War II. It's slightly slimy for our taste, perhaps also a product of too much sauce, and ultimately, bland. The usual narrative is that the Nazis were embedded in Europe, and the only way to end the war was to open up a second front. But as historian William Hitchcock notes, the Allies had been perfectly happy for years to let Russia absorb Nazi aggression on the Eastern Front, though they couldn't say so publicly. And as the History News Network argues, the Germans were more or less doomed to lose the war ever since they failed to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941. Which transformed the war from an aggressive invasion to a slow war of attrition. Put simply, in a grinding war of attrition the math wasn't on Germany's side. If the Nazis were already in retreat and doomed. In fact, just a few weeks after D-Day the Russians spearheaded an operation that dwarfed Operation Overlord in every way, Operation Bagration, which involved a staggering 2.3 million men. So if it wasn't crucial to ending the war, why put so much effort into D-Day? One reason was Allied worries that the Red Army would simply roll over Europe. In fact, this was the stated strategy of the Soviet Politburo in 1944. Chang's made the chicken itself spicy. Instead of just focusing their efforts on seasoning the breading, maybe we would be bigger fans of this dish. Operation Overlord was as much about stopping the Russian takeover of Europe as it was the defeat of the Nazis. The Allies created a fake army and navy. The Allied forces knew the Normandy invasion was far from a sure thing. The Nazis built an impressive defensive line that stretched 2,400 miles of French coastline, and they 100% knew the invasion was coming. If they guessed the location correctly, the chances of failure would be much higher. So the Allies created one of the greatest deception campaigns of all time. Operation Bodyguard involved placing the very real General George Patton in charge of a very fake army called the 1st U.S. But as it currently stands, it's just a less sticky, slightly spicier version of the previous chicken dish. 12. Sesame Chicken. As a kid, Sesame Chicken was our favorite. Army Group, FUSAG, in order to convince the Germans that any invasion of Normandy would actually be a feint to draw Hitler's forces away from the real invasion, which would take place at Calais. The dish is above average anywhere you go, but P.F. Chang's does it particularly well, piling on the sesame sauce and coating every slab of chicken in juicy, thick deliciousness. Patton was chosen precisely because the Nazis knew him very well, and he was a believable choice to lead a major invasion of Europe. As Sky History TV reports, an entire fake army and navy was created in order to cloud Nazi intelligence and add credence to the Calais ruse. Inflatable tanks and fake boats were constructed, as were fake military installations that looked plausible in grainy spy photos. Sesame seeds deck the top of the chicken, stuck on in a way that's less off-putting and more just dynamic, creating a subtle added texture that makes the entire dish stand out. The pieces of chicken themselves are a better cut than in P.F. Chang's other chicken staples, i.e. entire teams were dedicated to generating convincing radio chatter for the Nazis to pick up. The ruse worked. Hitler hedged his bets, which softened the resistance at Normandy, and even kept several army divisions near Calais for days after D-Day, still worried the invasion was just a trick. A rehearsal operation failed hard. Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasions Americans refer to as D-Day took years and years of careful planning. The crispy honey and the Chang spicy Here, they are larger and more rectangular, and every bite is a noticeably better ratio of chicken to breading. Instead of feeling like you're eating fried dough with a hint of chicken, when you dig into the sesame chicken you feel like you're getting the real, meaty deal. And the chicken isn't even the best part of this delicacy. When it comes down to it, the broccoli steals the show here. So it isn't too surprising to learn that the Allied forces planned a dress rehearsal to test out equipment and training. What might be a little surprising is how disastrous that rehearsal ended up being. As BBC News explains, the operation was code-named Exercise Tiger. On April 28, 1944, 8 ships designed to convey and land tanks on the beaches of Normandy were sailed with full cargoes to Slapton Sands near Devon, England, where the beach had been fortified similarly to Normandy. The Allies arranged to have live artillery fired near the ships to make the landings as realistic as possible. History reports that 23,000 troops were loaded onto the ships, which headed out to sea, then turned around and returned to stage the practice landing. But the radio chatter attracted German submarines, which launched an attack on the Allied vessels. Soaked in the same sesame sauce as the chicken, perhaps just by virtue of sitting beneath it in the takeout container, this broccoli has all of the flavor and none of the unhealthiness of the chicken. If we could order sesame broccoli, we would. A British destroyer was supposed to have accompanied the ships, but had been ordered elsewhere at the last minute, leaving the tank ships undefended. 3 ships were hit by German torpedoes. When the sailors hit the water, they discovered to their horror that they were wearing their life jackets incorrectly, leading many to die of hypothermia in the frigid water. But until someone decides to actually create that dish, ordering sesame chicken and picking out the broccoli is the next best thing. While good, P.F. Chang's sesame chicken offering ultimately doesn't rank higher because it's still just chicken. 11. The disaster costs 800 lives, but the families of the army covered it all up to maintain security. The most famous D-Day photos might be lies. If you've seen the famous black and white photos of Omaha Beach on D-Day, you've seen the work of Robert Capa. Dynamite Shrimp, in our opinion, P.F. known as the Magnificent 11. These are the only surviving photos of about 106 Capa claimed to have shot after accompanying one of the first waves of landings on the beach and remaining there under fire for about 90 minutes, when his camera jammed. Chang's does a much better job with their seafood than they do with poultry. Exhibit A. The Dynamite Shrimp. This appetizer, which could also function as a meal, for shrimp enthusiasts, presents a lot of the same issues as the crispy honey and Chang's spicy chicken do. There'd way too much tempura batter here and, again, the batter is not quite as crispy as we'd like it to be. The rest of the negatives were destroyed in an accident in the developing lab. And that's claimed, because recently Capa's story has come under question. The key difference, of course, is what lies beneath the batter. Where the aforementioned options revolved around bits of chicken, this delicacy is built around shrimp. And it turns out, that makes all the difference. Unlike the chicken options, this app doesn't skimp on the amount of shrimp in each piece. It's far more than the bite-sized nugget that's standard with the chicken. The juicy piece of shellfish is flavorful and thick, tasting both salty and fresh all at once and leaving you ready to pop the next piece into your mouth. The meat is not the only upgrade that the Dynamite Shrimp boasts. Petapixel explains that a careful investigation implies that Capa landed at an unusually calm area of the beach almost out of range of the guns trained on it, that he stayed on the landing boat for about 2 minutes before wading in closer, took a grand total of 11 photos, and then raced for another landing craft for the trip back after just 15 to 30 minutes. Further, investigators point out that the story about the lab accident that supposedly destroyed the negatives doesn't make sense. Other film shot by Capa showing less dramatic scenes were processed without a problem, and no one with any sort of darkroom experience would have made the decisions supposedly made with the rest.
This appetizer is tossed in a sriracha aioli, which almost automatically makes it delicious, and plated with shredded cabbage, lettuce, and carrots. The only qualm we have, beyond the shrimp's over-battered nature, is that Omaha Beach was a brutal bloodbath and no one would blame Capa for getting out as fast as possible, but the possibility that he lied about his experience there threatens to shade his reputation. There were war crimes and atrocities on both sides. War is ugly and violent, but over the decades the narrative of D-Day has been established via movies and TV shows to be one of heroism and sacrifice. The soldiers landing on the beach that day are usually depicted as humble men drafted into one of the most important and dangerous invasions, reluctantly practicing violence. The Nazis, naturally, get a less positive spin. The truth is there were war crimes on both sides, massacres, sexual assaults, torture, and worse. HistoryNet reports many incidents where Nazi soldiers outright murdered Canadian prisoners of war, including more than 150 who were killed while trying to surrender. After the war, the German officers involved in the incidents were identified, but only one, Kurt Meyer, pictured, was tried for war crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but only served 5 years. As the Washington Post notes, the Allies weren't immune from atrocities. Chang's lists this app as spicy, as denoted by a flame on the menu. After the Normandy landings, many American troops were accused of sexual assault. This made us excited about potential heat, and ultimately, we were disappointed. The Dynamite Shrimp is good, but not spicy. 10. Vegetable spring rolls. There's nothing like a solid vegetable spring roll at any restaurant, and PF General Omar Bradley warned the Supreme Commander Dwight D. Chang's as no exception. On the P. Eisenhower about looting, pillaging, wanton destruction, rape, and other crimes being committed by Americans. But almost none of these crimes were reported or prosecuted. Chang's menu. These puppies are described as crispy rolls stuffed with julienne veggies, and sweet chili dipping sauce. We're here to tell you that they just about nailed that wordage. The rolls, unlike other misnamed menu items, are actually quite crispy. The wrapping is thin and neatly folded, although one of ours did come slightly misshapen, as you can see. It didn't affect the taste, which, overall, was flavorful and enduring. Of course, the dominating notes were that of the fried wrapper, but the julienne veggies did hold their own, making for a mouth-watering combo. These rolls do have room for improvement, though. The one word that wasn't quite accurate in their description is stuffed. That adjective conjures images of a roll that's absolutely bursting with vegetables, which simply isn't the case here. Instead, they coat the bottom half of the tube, leaving a lot of space for air in every bite. To amp up their roll game, PF Chang's could definitely throw another handful of veggies in there. At the end of the day, though, the lack of vegetables isn't a deal breaker. These rolls have the signature spring roll taste, and honestly, dunking them in the sweet chili sauce results in a pop of flavor that ends up being all you really need to forget about any potential drawbacks of the dish. 9. Pork egg rolls. A second roll option from PF Chang's. The pork egg rolls are indisputably better than their vegetable spring roll competition. We weren't rooting for these, honestly. For health reasons alone, we assumed we'd favor the veggie option. However, one bite into this appetizer and it was clear. We immediately wanted to finish the whole roll. Which, when you're 15 dishes of PF Chang's deep, means something. The pork is dry and shredded to a point that makes it less offensive than we were imagining, and the julienne veggies pack the same flavor they did in the spring roll, except here, there is definitely more of them. The roll as a whole is thicker, more densely packed, and as a small bonus, this duo came more neatly wrapped than the spring rolls did. Beyond plating this appetizer with rice noodles, PF Chang's includes a side of sweet and sour mustard sauce, which is a definite showstopper and, surprisingly, airs more on the sour side than the sweet. Taken with the semi-sweet pork and the julienne vegetables, the sauce adds a powerful punch, carrying from the first bite through to the aftertaste. While both roll options are flavorful, if your diet doesn't restrict you from the pork egg rolls, we'd recommend giving them a try first. The veggie rolls will always be there for the next Chinese night. 8. Miso glazed salmon. The miso glazed salmon is hard to rank fairly because, in full transparency, we got it delivered. Not that delivery should affect taste to any notable degree, but if it ever were to, it would be in the case of a fresh fish fillet. This dish is meant to come flying out of the pan, onto a plate, and maybe even still be a little too hot by the time it gets to you. Instead, our delivery salmon came off the stove, was sealed into a plastic container, traveled 25 blocks downtown, and then up 5 flights of stairs. A different journey, and one that it's easy to imagine might make anyone a little less flavorful than they usually are. The delivery salmon still pulled a fairly high ranking, all things considered. It takes 8th place out of 15 dishes, which means that with this menu option, we are officially transitioning from dishes we're less crazy for to the top-ranking dishes that we're all about. The salmon tasted fresh, if a little dry. The work PF Chang's did to char the skin to a buttery crisp was definitely the standout factor here, and the spinach, cabbage and garlic ginger aromatics made for a strong backdrop. Even if you're not big on mushrooms, the Asian mushrooms in this dish are well cooked and seasoned to a point where they're hardly objectionable. Overall, we'd recommend the salmon, especially if you live closer to a PF Chang's. 7. Kung Pao Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are almost difficult to rank, for a simple reason. having Brussels sprouts is legitimately always better than not having them. Even if they aren't the most memorable sprouts you've ever had, or the most impressive, you still have the privilege of enjoying one of nature's greatest creations. Small, round, bite-sized vegetables. There's nothing more convenient, healthy, or fun to eat than that. With that caveat explained, we will say that P.F. Chang's Kung Pao Brussels sprouts aren't the most delicious we've ever had. Take that critique in stride, as we attempt to order Brussels sprouts at any restaurant that will serve them, so we've sampled quite a few. On the menu, P.F. Chang's describes them as wok charred Brussels sprouts, peanuts, chili pods, with Kung Pao sauce. Maybe it was just a case of too much Kung Pao sauce, but these sprouts did not have a charred texture. In fact, each individual leaf was practically dripping, and the dish as a whole was mush with peanuts and chili pods sprinkled in. The peanuts were an interesting touch, but the chili pods were bizarrely tough to bite into and we're not sure how much flavor they actually contributed to the appetizer. Usually, you can convince yourself you're doing something healthy by opting for Brussels sprouts over another appetizer. In this case, the sheer amount of sweet sauce makes it less feasible to do so. However, these are still sprouts, so order away. 6. Beef with broccoli. If we were giving superlatives to these rankings, the beef with broccoli would take most unexpected. As rare consumers of red meat due to flavor and texture alone, we did not have high hopes for P.F. Chang's classic main. The beef, by all accounts, shouldn't taste that different than the lowest-ranking Mongolian beef. Both are flank steaks, and although P.F. Chang's menu doesn't specify, it looks like the beef with broccoli is slathered in the same sweet soy glaze as its Mongolian cousin. But for some reason, these beef dishes could not taste more different. Perhaps it was the addition of ginger garlic aromatics in this one that did the trick, or maybe the green onion. Either way, we couldn't get enough of this meal, which is in reality fairly standard. Thinking back to the Sesame Chicken, for a minute, remember how the broccoli was the main event in that dish? It ends up bearing the same crown here. The steamed broccoli is just as good as it was in the Sesame Chicken plate, but here, it is doused in even more sauce. We ended up eating more steak than we expected to, but powered straight through all of the broccoli. There's nothing like fresh, steamed veggies smothered in a sweet-tasting soy sauce that retains a slightly beefy flavor. 5. Chang's chicken lettuce wraps. The beef with broccoli was an unexpected favorite, but the Chang's chicken lettuce wraps were a completely expected favorite. Just look at this dish. First of all, it can be made to be gluten-free, which is an added bonus when you're loading up on Chinese food. Second, it is clearly fresh, and unlike other dishes, you know exactly what you're getting, almost. The lettuce is buttery and surprisingly sturdy enough to effectively wrap the chicken rice noodles and sauce all in one bundle. The chicken is incredible. The only poultry option we truly enjoyed from P.F. Chang's, and we will never know how to replicate it because, as P.F. Chang states on their menu, it's a secret. Actually, what they say exactly is, a secret family recipe and our signature dish. Enough said. Talk about a confident glow. This is a dish for those who enjoy control. Perhaps the greatest part is the power to carefully balance out your own ratios, leaving nothing to chance, or to the P.F. Chang's kitchen.
We had fun experimenting with different ways to eat this one. If you order other dishes alongside the Chang's chicken lettuce wraps, there's even more room to get creative. For example, how about a lettuce wrap filled with broccoli, dynamite shrimp, and Brussels sprouts? The options are endless. 4. Crispy green beans. While the crispy green beans only come in 4th overall in this rating, which we're basing on a healthy mix of look, taste, and nutritional value, they're absolutely number 1 when it comes to the most addicting dish you can get at P.F. Chang's. We downed these in about 3 minutes flat, which, as you can imagine, made for a rough rest of the taste test. In true fried food fashion, the crispy green beans are just as incredible going down as they are terrible to digest. These fall in the same realm as the Kung Pao Brussels sprouts. A vegetable that probably has lost most of its healthiness by the time it's served. Even still, it's one that you can still easily convince yourself, isn't that bad. It's a vegetable, after all. It has to be at least a little bit good for you. Not the way we eat them. These incredible, truly crispy fried wonders are tempura battered and come with not one but 2 sides of P.F. Chang's signature spicy dipping sauce, which tastes like chipotle mayo to us. We found the most delectable way to inhale these was to practically soak them in the sauce before biting. Assuming you know the people you're dining with well, double dips should not only be permitted, but encouraged. You know you're doing it right if, like us, you had about 1/4 of a plate of green beans left with 2 scraped clean sauce containers. 3. Chili garlic green beans. P.F. Chang's second option for green beans, the chili garlic green beans, does not evoke quite as much passion. Were they good? Yes. Were they better than the fried green beans? Debatable. However, when it comes to health and factoring in how each dish made us feel after eating, these green beans edged out the competition. Made with fiery red chili sauce, fresh garlic, and Sichuan preserves, these green beans are another P.F. Chang's menu item with the fire symbol next to them, meant to warn you about heat, that end up not actually being all that hot. In this case, though, the lack of spiciness worked for them. They are great and somewhat light tasting on their own, but also versatile enough to mix into any other dish you might have tacked on to the order. These green beans are absolutely drenched in the chili sauce, which is thicker than we had expected and makes us question how much healthier than the crispy green beans these could actually be. But then we caught sight of our empty, secret sauce containers and felt assured. These green beans are definitely the more nutritious and overall less regrettable option. 2. Hand-folded crab wontons. These wontons were wonderful. Sorry. But it's true. The level of mastery and innovation P.F. Chang's brings to this appetizer is staggering. From the crispy shell that you can tell is freshly baked to the crab filling, which the menu describes as creamy, for once, we agree with the menu here, to the bell pepper and green onion additions and the spicy plum sauce. There's nothing not to love about this plate, which is equal parts aesthetically pleasing and tasty. The crab wontons dish is yet another instance of P.F. Chang's seafood really shining, as the meat in these delicacies was fresh and perfectly shredded, despite being mixed with cream. The bottom part of the wonton is completely full, skating around qualms we had with other P.F. Chang's dishes, and something about the verbiage, hand-folded, just makes these seem superior. If you're going to order one appetizer and one appetizer only for your Chinese food night, we recommend highly considering the hand-folded crab wontons. As number 2 overall on our list, they're more or less the dish to beat. 1. Shrimp dumplings. But then, finally, we have the ultimate dish to be beat. This appetizer, which we would argue might actually make for a nice, light, inexpensive meal, was the most authentic tasting of anything on the P.F. Chang's menu. When ordering, you're given a choice: pan-fried or steamed. We opted for steamed, thinking it may provide a much-needed reprieve from the copious amount of other fried dishes on the menu, and we were right. Not only was it a refreshing change of pace while tasting, but the steamed nature of these bad boys ultimately placed them permanently in a league above the rest of the dishes we had delivered. Beneath the sticky, soft dough, which was lightly drizzled with a chili sauce, so subtle, the shrimp dumplings were truly stuffed with their namesake meat. The shrimp was just as fresh, flavorful, and delicious as it was in the Dynamite Shrimp option, but without the fried factor to detract, the shrimp taste truly owned the whole flavor profile.
These pair nicely with the semi-spicy sauce that they're served with, but are also just as good without. Although it was a tight race for first between the hand-folded crab wontons and the shrimp dumplings, we felt lighter and less sluggish after finishing the latter. That, plus their pure and bold shrimp flavor, ultimately put the dumplings ahead.